In this episode, we speak with Brian Barlow, co-founder and CEO of Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, otherwise known as SIP, a company focused on building and scaling businesses that support the next generation of critical energy and digital infrastructure. As demand for energy and computing power continues to grow, existing infrastructure systems are facing increasing strain. SIP develops businesses and projects designed to help modernize these systems and enable more intelligent, scalable infrastructure for the future. Brian has spent more than 3 decades as a private markets investor across technology and infrastructure. Prior to co-founding SIP, he served as Director of Infrastructure Investments for Alphabet's Urban Innovation Platform. Prior to that, he was a Managing Director at American Infrastructure Funds. Earlier, Brian was a senior member of Scion Capital, the investment firm founded by Dr. Michael Burry and featured in The Big Short. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the managing partner of Growth Cap and the executive chairman of Market Insight Media. He is the host of Growth Investor, a podcast featuring today's best investors, executives, and founders. In the minutes ahead, we'll uncover insights and strategies for accelerating growth and succeeding in business.
Brian, thanks so much for taking the time. It's a delight to be with you.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So we've had Sidewalk on before several years ago. So it would be great to, refresh and, of course, learn a little bit more about you. But our audience is not going to remember that first episode we did. Maybe what we could do is start with the history, because you're a spin out, and then we'll go into what you focus on, which is huge. It's like the predominant news these days, the CapEx spend related to AI infrastructure. But yeah, to start, maybe we go with the history.
Sure. Why don't I spend a couple minutes just going through my background? Because it was kind of an unusual route as to how I ended up at Alphabet and then, at Sidewalk Labs, which ultimately spawned Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. So some of that history might be apropos to how we got to where we are today. So I've been a private markets investor for a little over 30 years. Actually graduated with a degree in architecture and urban planning, of all things, in 1992. And at the time, there was nothing really being built. So I actually got pulled into the dark side of investing pretty early, joined what you would call today a hedge fund, working on the buy side, actually covering the real estate industry, mostly really arcane securities called REITs, or real estate investment trusts. So I spent the first part of my career in real estate, which then kind of evolved into covering the telcos and utility companies, since this was a high yield equity kind of strategy. And so did that for about 4 years. Like a lot of people early in their career, I kind of had the imposter syndrome. I think I had one finance class in school and felt that I needed to kind of like backfill or buttress kind of my finance skills. So went back to business school in 1996. And then when I graduated in 98, the market was very different. It was kind of the boom times, especially out in Silicon Valley. It was kind of the very early stages of the internet build out, or the, kind of the early stages of the dot-com, what ultimately became the dot-com bubble. And so I moved west and helped start a venture capital firm. Really had no experience investing in the private markets, but had a lot of experience trying to understand kind of the evolution that the telco companies were making, kind of transitioning their, copper-based networks to IP-based networks, which ultimately became the backbone of the internet. So did a lot of communications, fiber investments, which then kind of led into the wireless market, as we kind of went from wired networks and wireless networks, then kind of went into cloud infrastructure. And lo and behold, I found myself investing in data centers. We ended up selling that fund to Jefferies in 2004, detoured a couple of years back into the public side, spent a couple more years in a hedge fund called Scion Capital, which many people might remember from the movie The Big Short. So Mike Burry and I worked together at Scion. And then about 2 or 3 years later, kind of yearned to get back to the private side. So me and 5 partners started a group called the American Infrastructure Fund, which was really to get back to my roots, which was looking at how technology was converging with infrastructure. And so we built that platform for about 12 years. It was a middle market kind of private equity fund. And then I got approached by Alphabet in probably 2016 to come talk to a gentleman named Dan Doctoroff, who had just joined Alphabet from Bloomberg. And prior to that, he was the deputy mayor under Bloomberg, for New York City. And they had just launched a company called Sidewalk Labs, or Alphabet did. And Sidewalk Labs, for people that aren't familiar with it, was a really bold ambition to think about how one would build a city from scratch. Like if you were to start today, kind of in the digital age, how would we rethink from first principles, everything that kind of makes up a city? And, obviously the foundation or the infrastructure is kind of the substrate in which a city is built. And so, I was asked to kind of think about what the future of infrastructure would look like, joined Sidewalk Labs as head of infrastructure. Did that for, probably 2 years, and met kind of a fellow private markets investor who ultimately was my co-founder. We basically pitched the Alphabet board that what the world really needed and what Alphabet needed was, investment platform focused on how we can bring the innovations or technologies that we were seeing that were really powering kind of next generation infrastructure systems, but had a really hard time just given kind of the structural nature of infrastructure, which has been, a pretty conservative asset class, was still being, financed largely through project finance. Project finance has historically and, continues today to be views technology as a risk factor, something to stay away from, structurally kind of work around, mitigate, remove as much as possible. And we try to flip that axiom on its head and say, technology is really the asset here. And how do we take advantage of, these emerging technologies and marry it into these long dated systems, which were essentially the essential services powering, our society today. And so we knew that we had to create effectively a whole different capital stack to be able to do that. Obviously, Alphabet has been really comfortable leaning into technology risk for a long time. And so they were certainly supportive, but they really wanted us to do it with partners. And what they meant by that was, as large as Google or Alphabet's balance sheet was, it probably didn't make sense for them to own transit hubs and like wastewater treatment plants and, other infrastructure systems on the balance sheet. And so they asked us to go find a partner or a set of partners that were already investing in infrastructure, but who were interested in kind of rethinking, how technology and infrastructure fit together. So in 2019, we partnered with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. It's one of the largest, Canadian pensions, who has been a direct investor in infrastructure for a long time. And while I would say all of the pension funds, I would categorize them as reasonably conservative, the Ontario Teachers tended to be the one that kind of leaned in to some of the earlier innovations, including data centers. And so, data centers are a little bit of a different class of infrastructure. I think if you asked data center investors 15 years ago, they probably wouldn't call them infrastructure. They'd probably call them some sort of PE investment or a real estate investment. They were largely relatively straightforward warehouses or boxes that you basically lease to technology company who was putting their equipment in there, but they weren't very technically complex. As we've kind of emerged towards, AI data centers and looking at how these data centers can work together in a network, they've gotten much more complex. Anyway, so in 2021, so 2 years after we brought the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan in, we started establishing some of our early development platforms. And so we brought in additional capital through a partner called Stepstone Group, which is familiar to you and your audience here. They've been great at basically crowding in some of their largest global infrastructure investors who wanted access or they wanted to participate in what I would call the frontier of infrastructure. That frontier 5 years ago was wireless networks and data centers, which are kind of now the ground zero or kind of the center of the fairway now. The big Berlin infrastructure conference, for example, in March, I think 90% of the discussions were around data centers and digital infrastructure. So it's been an interesting journey. I think the crux of what we were trying to do is take long dated capital. So Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, or SIP, is actually structured as like a holding company. So we're a company and effectively have a perpetual life to it. And so we continuously raise capital from our existing partners and other partners from time to time to bring on capital onto our balance sheet. And then we invest in the operating platforms, many of which we start from scratch. And so while we call ourselves investors and most of our backgrounds are from private equity and project finance and venture capital backgrounds, we run it as an operating company. The original thesis was pretty broad. It was largely around, how is technology reshaping infrastructure? So I think we call ourselves a technology-enabled infrastructure investment platform. More recently, in the last 2 years, we saw kind of the enormous opportunity in the convergence of, energy and digital infrastructure, namely data centers. And so we've narrowed our focus to focus exclusively in, that Venn diagram, or probably more appropriately, the rapid collision of energy and, compute infrastructure. And that's been our focus to date.
That's super helpful. It definitely brings to light the evolution of infrastructure and technology and, the various parties. Obviously, you were at a place that had deep insight into how infrastructure would pan out and, being Google, and they're able to see into the future. Maybe to bring this more to life, let's go into your platforms, which can showcase that Venn diagram and the overlap and how you're kind of able to find those opportunities or develop those opportunities.
Sure. Let me give you one anecdote because I think it was interesting. Like when I first was approached by this opportunity by Dan at Sidewalk Labs, I had some reservations. I'd been like I said, a private markets investor for a long time. I was part of a group that was doing quite well. We were very comfortable. And this was a really nebulous concept. Here we have, Google/Alphabet wanting to get into infrastructure. And they have dabbled in infrastructure for a long time, obviously. Their data center platform that powers, the entire Google backend is, by any measure, one of the largest infrastructure projects in the country. But they had started stepping into like Google Fiber, for example. Waymo, the autonomous vehicle business, was driving cars around cities. And so infrastructure became more and more of import to them. And when I was talking to them, they'd actually just run a really interesting pilot, which is kind of the thing that kind of brought me over, kind of sold me. They had bought this company called DeepMind. You might be familiar with DeepMind. It was actually just kind of a machine learning research arm in the UK. DeepMind has become kind of one of the core pieces of the AI strategy within Google and Alphabet. But when they bought DeepMind, they didn't really know what to do with it. And so one of the things that they did was they actually applied it towards their internal data center platform and said, I bet we can find some really interesting insights. And what was kind of funny was, the people that ran the data centers, were some of the most sophisticated engineers and operations team. And they kind of scoffed that, some machine learning platform would be able to come up with some ideas to run the data center more efficiently. And lo and behold, after like 4 months, setting up kind of the training data, they started getting some really interesting insights as to how they can curtail load, curtail compute clusters to dramatically improve the energy efficiency. And after about 9 months of trial and error, they found about 40% energy savings opportunities within their own system. So there was a big light bulb that went off, and that was kind of the light bulb that went off for me as well, which was, gosh, if you have a sophisticated platform like Google's backend that can see such opportunity from this new technology, it wasn't called AI back then, it was really machine learning, apply that towards traditional infrastructure systems and what might be the possibilities. That was kind of the aha moment, or kind of the thing that ultimately brought me over. Look, our two platforms, one is a very large but early stage AI third-party development platform. So we're building hyperscale campuses for the benefit of the hyperscalers, not just Google. In fact, most of the projects we're working on are non-Google tenant opportunities. We can talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then the other platform is what is arguably, if not the largest, one of the largest virtual power plants. The core overlap between the two businesses is, you hear a lot about how much more capacity we need on the grid. Most of the conversation is around what marginal new infrastructure do we need? What type of generation do we need? Where emerging technologies like SMR, kind of the small modular nuclear reactors, the amount of transmission and distribution system we need. We started with the premise that if you look at the grid today, I think it's about 850 gigawatts of total capacity, nameplate capacity, yet we're only using up 480 gigawatts on average at any given time. And so for a variety of different reasons, we've dramatically over-engineered and overbuilt the grid. And there's a lot of capacity that, remains latent and trapped. It's not all trapped because of technology. There's lots of commercial and policy reasons that it's hard to access. But if you think about the capacity utilization of the grid today, it's lower than it was in the 1970s. And so for a variety of reasons, we built the grid in a real inefficient way. And now everybody's scrambling, trying to find, where can I get a gigawatt of capacity, or where can I get a gigawatt interconnect? And, those are very large, ambitious projects that take, many, many years to get. Yet we have 350 gigawatts sitting right in front of us. And so the question is, how do we get 10% of that? How do we get 20% of that? That's, 35 to 70 gigawatts of capacity that exists today, doesn't need to be built. It's somewhat of a technology problem. It's mostly a policy and orchestration problem, but that's where we see the opportunity. And so between the virtual power plant opportunity, which is like, how do we extract kind of the peak load events out of the grid to provide flexible load, to the utility partners? Or how do we convince a utility that, Verus, which is the name of our data center platform, that this is a more flexible design that allows them to bring on a large load customer for them to continue to grow their business and sell more energy, but do it in a way that doesn't kind of amplify some of the challenges on the grid today. So those are the two platforms that we spend an enormous amount of time on. The data center platform, obviously, we call it our beast. We started it from scratch as an incubation. We spun a small team out of Google initially to focus on kind of the orchestration layer of the tech stack. And we've kind of built the organization to be a full stack third-party developer. The development pipeline has gotten quite large, as you can imagine. The number of projects, the size of the projects have only kind of, expanded exponentially over time. We probably have a $10 to a $20 billion pipeline of opportunities. So that keeps us very busy, as you can imagine. And then the virtual power plant is really the underlying assets of that business are the Nest Energy smart thermostats. And so we had a small technology company at SIP or at Sidewalk before. We ended up merging the Nest Energy business out of Google. So Google continues to own Nest, the hardware business, the smart thermostat company that most people recognize under that name. But below the hardware business is an energy services business. Basically, how do you orchestrate about 9 million thermostats here in the US and do it in a way that's coordinated and works with various utilities? So I think we're up to about 6 gigawatts of load under control across those, 8 million thermostats. So it's a significant load. As I said, it's one of the largest virtual power plants today under that metric. And thermostats are a really interesting and attractive, edge device to manage load. But we're looking to dramatically grow that business beyond just thermostats. So home batteries, obviously, as more and more EVs are parking in the car, we're going to have very large batteries going in and out of the garage. And how do we orchestrate both the storage assets in people's homes, but also kind of the demand response devices?
Yeah, fascinating. I'm curious if that's in the common knowledge base of most people, that you can actually harness energy, if I'm understanding it correctly, harness energy from homes.
Yeah, look, I think it's one of the biggest opportunities there is. I consider homes like distributed infrastructure, whether it's, solar on the rooftop, more and more people have home batteries, whether it's the Powerwall. They're very interesting, like startup company called Base Power, which is Michael Dell's son, Zach Dell, who's creating a really interesting company, oversizing batteries and selling energy in the ERCOT or Texas market, but using that excess capacity to provide grid services and virtual power plant services back to the grid. So I think the actual distributed energy devices in people's homes will actually be one of the largest opportunities in the next 5 to 10 years. I know everybody's focused on kind of the next gigawatt scale campus in Missouri or Oklahoma. I think the opportunity is right in everybody's home. And there was a recent announcement by a company called Scion with NVIDIA that is now talking about putting distributed GPUs on the side of people's houses. And so, it's a really interesting concept to marry kind of the energy that exists within the home envelope with compute on obviously a very edge and distributed basis. TBD as to what the use case is for, GPUs, atomized and distributed, but it's a pretty novel and interesting concept.
Do you spend any time thinking about the idea of putting these data centers on the moon?
Not yet. Although I am going to this event this weekend. It's an event that Eric Schmidt and his venture firm host called Curiosity Camp. And it's about 150 people. It's a mixture of people that are large company executives, a lot of people from government and various policy executives, and then a bunch of the startup community, and kind of put everybody together in a really remote Boy Scout camp in Northern California. We talk about kind of the future of a lot of different things. And one of the talks that I'm giving is data centers in space or data centers on orbit, of which, the punchline is I'm pretty skeptical of just from a physics perspective, but to the extent we could solve some of the engineering or physics challenges, it represents a really interesting opportunity. So whether it's on orbit, in space, on the moon, that'll probably be for my kids to try to figure it out versus myself, but it's a pretty intriguing opportunity.
So it sounds like you feel like there is capacity out there, energy capacity, but it's just not being utilized or harnessed in an efficient or effective way. And so with all the projects happening out there, these new builds, hundreds of billions of dollars going into CapEx, do you think there's a chance for overbuilding?
I do. I never really thought of my career as like a linear progression, but, I was involved in, the internet build out, like I said, the actual wired build out. The people that lived through the early 2000s probably remember the dark fiber boom and bust, where people were very ambitious with respect to laying down speculative infrastructure. It's called dark fiber for a reason. It wasn't lit up. So very different circumstances. But if you look just even at history, go back to the late 1800s when we built the railroad network. If you look at like who owns the railroads today, it's the third or fourth owner of that infrastructure. And the reason it's the third or fourth owner is they, infrastructure cycles tend to go through boom and bust cycles. The capital markets tend to get carried away. People start using really sophisticated or complex structures that probably aren't appropriate for where we are in some of the innovation evolution. And I'm starting to see a little bit of that now. A lot of the big projects are very creatively financed. They have a lot of echoes of some things I've seen historically that didn't go quite so well. And so we've been very cautious, at my firm to both capitalize them conservatively with using almost all in equity, other than, once we get into the final project development, and also make sure that we're building, infrastructure that is flexible enough to really kind of withstand the test of time. There's an analogy that my investors hear me use in the data center space, which is, to borrow a term from the commercial real estate market, there's something called a Class A and a Class B office building. And Class A office building typically is just a newer building that happens to have better amenities, maybe a better location. And over about 15, 20 years, that Class A office building kind of devolves into a Class B office building. It doesn't mean that it's not worth a lot. There's, Class B office buildings, Class C office buildings tend to have just as much occupancy. They just command a lower rental or lease rate. The same thing is happening in data centers already, but the time compression is compressing dramatically. I think that, a data center that is commissioned last year will probably be irrelevant to the frontier models in 4 or 5 years. Just the architecture, the energy management systems that are powering it, the power density that we're going to need to basically power kind of these emerging rack configurations, the distances involved in, the optical wiring between, these compute clusters. A data center that was built for like AWS or Google Cloud, enterprise customers 5 years ago is, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but it's much less interesting. So we're going to see a dramatic evolution in the space. There's lots of discussion around AI training models versus inference. What does that mean with respect to how much power you need? Sustainability, whether it's around kind of the carbon intensity of the power, the resource intensity around water continues to be really big issues. And so I think the folks that are really on the frontiers of where energy and power demands are going, along with the other kind of what I call environmental or community concerns, is going to be kind of the dividing rod of which data centers kind of cross the chasm with respect to maximum value versus the ones that kind of devolve into what I call the Class B or Class C category.
We're coming up on time. I do have 2 final standard questions. These veer, I guess, more towards the personal, but one is, can you tell us a little bit about a person who has had the most profound influence on you?
Oh gosh. You always think of mentors or people that are really impactful. You kind of harken back to like your earlier days, like when you're younger. Probably one of the persons that's had one of the most profound impacts on me is Dan Doctoroff, who I mentioned earlier. So Dan, had a very storied career in private equity. He actually volunteered to be the Olympic Committee chair for New York, thought about how New York kind of reconfigured their infrastructure to support that Olympic bid. That bid ended up failing or didn't win. Yet one of the main sites that was proposed for some of the venues became Hudson Yards. And so people that are familiar with New York City, Hudson Yards is probably one of the largest new successful developments that's kind of reoriented where the center of gravity in Manhattan is today. He left government in the Bloomberg administration to run Bloomberg, the financial technology company. He was a very successful CEO there. And then he joined Alphabet to start Sidewalk Labs. What I have really loved about him, there's some people that just put out this like almost absurd vision as to what the reality is in such a compelling and forceful way, and then attract magnetically the people necessary to make it happen, and just walks through walls to make it happen. For people that know Dan's story, he tragically came down with ALS, of which he's publicly fighting today. He had to step down from Sidewalk Labs, and ultimately Sidewalk Labs got folded back into Google. Absent his leadership, it kind of lost the inertia to move forward. But he is a phenomenal, just kind of human. He was effectively a co-founder of Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, great friend and colleague. And just watching him in his current capacity, fight it with strength and character has just been really admiring to watch. And so, yeah, I'd probably put Dan at the top of the list.
Last question. Can you tell us about a charity, cause, or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
Oh gosh, this is gonna be a little embarrassing. I have 5 kids, and so between Sidewalk Infrastructure, which is effectively running 5 startups, and 5 kids in high school and college, those have been consuming most of my time. So, look, most of my efforts that aren't directly applied towards my day job tend to be adjacent. So working with some of the schools on some development campaigns in which they're working with one of the schools of which I was involved in, one of my son's MIT, working to help develop some of their facilities around design and architecture, but also what's called the CSAIL lab, which is the computer science and AI lab. They're working on some really cool stuff. Most of the stuff I'm working on tends to be around synthetic biology, which is an area that my son is spending a lot of time in what's called the BCI space, so brain computer interface, which is something I know very little about, but I just find it fascinating. It's essentially the industry in which Neuralink, Elon Musk's, 5th or 6th company is focused on. So that's been a big focus. And then indirectly, I spent some time with some friends here. I live in Manhattan Beach. And so there's a big environmental organization called Heal the Bay, which is, how do you restore, Santa Monica Bay? How do we ensure that it remains clean and plastic free? And so I've been, supporting a lot of the efforts that mostly my friends are leading. So I don't want to mislead the audience that's something that I'm spearheading, but those are the things that have caught my interest lately.
Wonderful. Brian, I want to thank you again for taking the time. It's been a great conversation.
Of course, pleasure. And thank you very much.